across the globe, this is a uniquely challenging moment. An opportunity to reimagine and rebuild the systems in which we live. Communities are hard at work to recover, and at Polar Bears International, we are inspired by the ways people around the world are caring for one another right now.
And we're committed to doing our part to support you.
So we'll be coming to you live from our homes across the globe, offering our annual Fall Tender Connections program. We have sessions dedicated to students of all ages, but our live broadcasts are available for anyone to enjoy.
Oh, hi! If you're a kid like me, go to Tundra Connections to learn all about polar bears and their favorite food, seals!
Buggy One will still be bringing you polar bears live from the tundra. Our team of familiar faces will use innovative software to continue to connect with you, at home, in the classroom, or wherever you may be. Join us for a lighthearted live chat, an educational webcast, or just zen out with the live cams.
Participate in conversations with scientists and take a deep dive into the world of polar bear research and policy. Ask your questions directly and learn from the experts.
Although we are physically distant, we can continue to find ways to be socially connected and come together with our friends, families, and communities.
We hope you'll join us to follow your curiosity and to find a little Arctic inspiration through virtual windows into the polar bear's world.
Hello, and welcome to Polar Bears International Tundra Connections webcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. Across the globe, this is a uniquely challenging moment. We're inspired by the ways people around the world are caring for one another and coming together right now, and we're committed to doing our part to support you. So we usually offer our Tundra Connections from Buggy One live on the shores of Hudson Bay. This year, of course, looks a little bit different. We weren't all able to get there, but we still have live footage from Buggy One for you today. You will hopefully be able to see live polar bears as we speak today, while you might see some of our staff and guests in the comfort of their own living rooms. Though this fall looks a little bit different, we think that now more than ever, the community can use a fresh opportunity for some Arctic inspiration and virtual learning. Though our content today is catered to kids, we think that anyone can get something out of today's broadcast. So we hope that anyone participates. And we hope that we can give you a window into the Arctic for anyone interested in polar bears and what Polar Bears International is doing. So today's webcast is called Tracking Polar Bears with STEM, using science and math to investigate the life of a polar bear. So it's a pretty fun topic. Our partner today is explore.org. And our target audience is about grade 6 and up, but again, we hope that anyone can participate. We plan to talk for about 30 to 45 minutes today with lots of time for questions, and our webcast will be archived on YouTube later for your viewing pleasure. And during the broadcast, please do send us your questions. We want to know what you want to know. So if you are watching on the polarbearsinternational.org website, there is a chat window right beneath what you're watching. So please put your questions there. Or you can email us anytime at questions@pbears.org. And we have a great team of moderators looking at those questions and shooting them to me on my computer. So I've got a few things up right now. I'm seeing what you're seeing. I'm seeing your questions coming in, and I want as many as you have. And we'll make sure if we don't get to them live, then we'll answer them via email for sure. So my name is Alysa McCall, and I'm a staff scientist at Polar Bears International, and I'm coming to you from my home in Whitehorse, Yukon. But we are so lucky to be joined by a couple other folks today. I'll introduce you first to Stephanie Penk, who's a PhD student over in Toronto. Stephanie, could you say hi and tell people a little bit about what it is you're studying?
Yeah, hi, and thank you for having me here today. My name is Stephanie Penk, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, where I study polar bear energetics using mathematics. So my research focuses on developing models that allow researchers to estimate polar bear energy use under the conditions we're projecting for the future in the Arctic.
Very cool, very important, and very neat use of math. Thank you, Stephanie. And we are also joined today by PBI staff member Jeff York. Jeff, you are in Churchill, one of the lucky few in Churchill right now. Can you say hi and tell people a bit about what you do?
Sure, I'm the Senior Director of Conservation at Polar Bears International. I've spent the last 20 years working on polar bears, 16 of those out on the ice, catching, collaring, tagging, and tracking bears, and about 27 years up in the Arctic. And I am super fortunate to be the only outside member of PBI to come to Churchill this year. It is very quiet up here, very different.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, a very different year, but again, we still do have live polar bear action for you. We have a couple local staff members that live in Churchill, and they're out on Buggy One right now. There, you can see what they're seeing at the moment. That's from Buggy One. We do have polar bears out on the tundra still. We're still live streaming every day. So please do check out explore.org anytime to see some polar bears. We have 5 different cameras spread across the tundra in different areas to see what's going on out there at this time of year. So let's talk a little bit about this time of year, but first I want to give just a quick to KT Miller, who's another Polar Bears International staff member, and it's KT who is doing all the mixing of this show today. So she's pulling all these streams in and doing all the editing and putting it out to you. So thank you so much, KT, and you might hear me ask KT to show a couple things later. So she's doing all that from her office in Montana. Pretty cool stuff. Another great use of technology. So let's talk just briefly first. Let's set the stage for these polar bears. How on earth are we watching polar bears right now? Why are they on land? So polar bears, of course, live on the sea ice for most of their lives. Polar bears are actually a marine mammal. That means they rely on the ocean for most of their food and life cycle. So these polar bears in Hudson Bay, though, for the summer months, there's no sea ice on Hudson Bay. It's too warm. The ice melts, so the bears come on land. For most of the summer, they hunker down, they stay pretty quiet, they conserve their energy, and they wait for the fall for the sea ice to freeze up as it gets cold again. Now, as soon as the sea ice is back, those polar bears are long gone, and we're not going to see them until next year. But right now, because it's starting to cool down, the polar bears know that the ice is coming, like that animated video is showing you there. So they're starting to move toward the coast around Churchill and up and down the shores of Hudson Bay, and they're ready. They're ready to get out on the ice as soon as it comes. But until then, they're being a little bit lazy like this guy here. So we can watch them just hanging out, maybe doing a bit of play fighting or sparring, which we've already seen a couple times today on the cam. So it's pretty neat that we are able to watch these bears in Churchill. Now, these are the Western Hudson Bay polar bears, part of that subpopulation, and there are 19 different subpopulations around the world. And depending on where the subpopulation is, the polar bears are studied in different ways. They kind of have different patterns maybe of sea ice that they have to deal with, and they might even have different preferences in the types of seals they eat or the types of food they get at different times of year. So polar bears are throughout the Arctic, and we use technology in different ways throughout the Arctic to study them. So I want to start our technology discussion with kind of maybe what seems like a pretty simple form of technology, but it's still a way that we are using science and engineering to tell us a bit about polar bears. So science is simply asking questions of what we see around us. And we see something and we say, well, how do we figure out why or how that is? And Jeff, I was hoping maybe you could tell us a little bit about the hair snare on in Russia right now that you were a part of last year, I guess. And we have a little video that KT will pull up as well.
Sure, last fall seems like 2 years ago. So in the video you're watching, you're seeing a young male cruise up along the beach. That's a metal box with something smelly inside. It's basically just some smelly juice we spilled on some rocks. When he sticks his head in like that, they're little wire brushes. They're like bottle brushes. And those brushes just grab onto some hair and hold on to it. So once the bear leaves, we can go out safely, grab the hair, put them in an envelope, and those hairs can be sent to the lab for genetic analysis. And so from a scientific standpoint, this simple action of the bear sticking its head in here and donating some hairs gives us what we call a capture. It gives us a genetic mark of this specific bear at this specific place on this specific date. And if we get enough of those, We can look at things like population size. If we get enough of those over time from different locations, we can say something in a coarse sense about movements. So it's, like Alysa said, it's kind of on the lower end in some respects of technology, but on the higher end of tech, on the genetic analysis side, it's pretty cool.
That is fascinating. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so you make that look pretty easy to collect this data from polar bears. Polar bears are pretty darn hard to study, actually. If you imagine a big, again, marine mammal that lives out in the Arctic on sea ice, they are not easy. Stephanie, could you maybe speak a little bit about how and why polar bears are so difficult to study and why we need to use these kind of innovative ideas to find out more about them?
Yeah, well, polar bears live in one of the most extreme environments on planet Earth. And while the polar bears are perfectly adapted to thrive there, researchers and their equipment certainly are not. So temperatures routinely reach below negative 40 degrees in the Arctic, which is actually when Celsius equals Fahrenheit. So it's negative 40 degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit. And that makes it extremely difficult for both humans and their instruments to function, not to mention the added wind chill from wind speeds that reach over 50 miles per hour. And as you mentioned, Alysa, the polar bears are roaming the Arctic sea ice whenever it's available. And that's where they hunt their primary prey, seals. And since ice melts and reforms, the polar bears don't stick to their territories. So they're roaming in this landscape that they blend very well in. So they're very hard to find. The Arctic Ocean is 1.5 times the size of the United States. So even finding the bears is a challenge. And as you mentioned, some of the subpopulations live on seasonal sea ice, meaning that sea ice disappears for a period of the year and the bears are forced to land. So that's actually why the Western Hudson Bay subpopulation is so well studied, because they're forced to land and they're more easily accessible by researchers for a time, summertime. But still, the instruments that they attach on those bears need to be able to survive those extreme conditions when they return to the ice.
That's for sure. Yeah, one of the cool instruments that we have been using to study polar bears for the last several decades, actually, is a GPS collar. So if you have a dog or cat at home, maybe they wear a collar around. Well, we can do the same to some polar bears. We have been putting on these GPS collars on female polar bears in the Western Hudson Bay for a while now. And you can see that collar in the photo there. So these collars are programmed to stay on a polar bear from about 1 to 2 years, depending, and then they drop off automatically. And the collar it might look a little big, but it's actually, it's designed to be proportionate to the polar bear's body weight so that it's actually quite light compared to how big the polar bear is. So it doesn't bother them at all. And we can only put them on females because males have such a big neck compared to their skull. They kind of have like a pylon-shaped neck and head that the collars slip right off. So here in this video, you can see a female polar bear wearing this collar. And the collars give incredible information. It, again, as Steph was saying, it's so difficult to know where these bears would go. We would really have no idea where polar bears roamed. We know, oh, they're out on the sea ice somewhere, but what are they doing and how are they moving in relation to the sea ice? And what types of sea ice do they like? We really would have so many questions. Well, we still do, but we can at least answer some of them using this GPS collar data. So these GPS collars track where the polar bear goes. They send info to a satellite, and scientists, including myself, we can sit at a computer and download that information from a satellite and then map it out on our computers and say, oh, here are the polar bears. And so you can also see some of this on the Polar Bears International Bear Tracker. This is online. It's a free tool. So go check it out. Every year there's different bears added. This year, again, may look a little bit different, but we're hoping that we can add a couple bears with ear tags, which we'll talk about in a minute. But you can go back in time and look at past bears that have been collared and see where they go in Hudson Bay. And I think it's very cool that we can compare bears. All the different bears we study, you know, they've learned different things from their mom. They have different conditions every year. They maybe have different personalities. And so they choose to do different things on the sea ice. And it's so valuable to see what these different bears are doing out there. And this sort of information can give scientists clues as to what polar bears need, which helps us conserve and protect them better as their sea ice habitat changes. which it is doing. So the Hudson Bay polar bears, the Western Hudson Bay anyway, they now are spending 3 to 4 weeks longer on land than they used to because the sea ice is melting earlier and freezing later due to climate change caused by burning too many fossil fuels. So we are seeing their homes being impacted already, and having information about how they're responding to that is so valuable for us to know how to help them. So this is one type of technology, these birds, but I want to kind of pop over to maybe a different part of the world real quick, and hope that Jeff, could you speak about the technology we use to study moms and cubs in Norway? Also very.
Sure. So that's another innovative solution to one of those kind of niggling problems, like Lisa talked about earlier. How in the world do we figure out what's going on at a den site when they're remote? Moms come out of their dens in the late winter, early spring, but it's still quite cold in most of the Arctic. It's super remote, hard to get to. So we set up remote camera systems. And over the years, our colleague BJ Kirschhoffer and others have taken this technology kind of to new heights and have shrunk it down smaller and smaller. So now it can fit in a Pelican case. You can see there in the video, it can be pulled on a sled. We use these flexible solar panels to power them up through that springtime. And we can actually set everything up while mom and cubs are still tucked away in their dens. And so they're not really aware of our presence there. And when they come out, there's just this box, you know, couple hundred yards off away, that's silent. And it sits there and slowly records when they come out, what they do there, how long they spend there, and importantly, how many cubs, if any, leave the den with the mom. So it gives us several different threads of information that we otherwise wouldn't have.
That's such fantastic footage that this project's been getting. And it's so important to protect moms and their cubs. These cubs are, of course, the future of the species. And it's critical that we make sure that they're healthy and that they have a habitat to go out onto. Thank you for that. I love those maternal den cams. They're so great. So we're going to backtrack back to Hudson Bay. But before that, I want to remind people, please do send us your questions. You can use the email questions@pbears.org. You can use the chat window under the questions video player on the polarbearsinternational.org website. And if you happen to be watching on Facebook, please do feel free to pop questions in there too. And hopefully they will get filtered onto me live. And if not, we'll answer them later anyway, for sure. So we're going to come back to Hudson Bay for a minute. And I want to talk about a different type of GPS technology, because of course, as we get better and technology gets better and more innovative, this sorts of technology that can start so big starts to shrink. So, you know, the original computers back in the day were like massive, the size of a full room or something. And now we're sitting on these little laptops. Well, the same is happening to GPS technology. It's able to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So for years, we've put out these collars, which still can collect the most data and very, very important data, because they are so robust, but we can shrink down the GPS portion now and actually put it in an ear tag on a polar bear. So when polar bears are handled by scientists, the polar bear is tranquilized safely and goes to sleep for about an hour or so while the scientists work on them. So no worries for either the bear or the person here. The polar bears do always get a little plastic ear tag with a number on it, and each bear gets its own individual number so that scientists can track that bear throughout its life. So if we capture that in the future, we can say, oh, this bear, its number is X31495, which doesn't sound very exciting, but it kind of is, because we can look back in our capture book and find that same bear and say, oh, this bear was last seen 5 years ago in this area. That sort of information can build out these life histories of these bears and tell us so much. But what we can do now is add a little GPS logger to some of these bears' ears. So we can actually stick a GPS unit in these ear tags and follow these bears for a few months at least. So again, they don't last as long because they're not quite as robust as the collars, but we can get some really critical information from these tags. So I mentioned a little earlier that we can only collar female polar bears, but we can put these GPS ear tag units on any bear. So now all of a sudden we are able to track the male bears and the bears, which are like the teenager bears, and figure out what the whole population is doing, or at least members of different parts of the population, what they're doing. And this builds such a more robust picture and can really help us better protect the species when we know what all the different bears are doing, no matter if you're male or female, or you have cubs or not, or if you're young or old. We're getting a better idea of what's going on out there. And these tags can also help prevent what we call human-bear conflict. Jeff, could you speak a little bit about how the GPS ear tags could maybe prevent an issue between humans and bears at certain times of the year?
Sure. So they're currently being used by University of Alberta and Sustainable Development here in Manitoba to look at conflict bears. So these are bears that are picked up in the Churchill area by the Polar Bear Alert Team. And in the past, they were just re-released out into the wild. Sometimes they're held for a bit. Some of them are helicoptered north a good 100 kilometers, and then they're let go. But we didn't know what they did next. And part of that was, as Alysa mentioned, we can only collar adult females. We typically don't have a lot of extra collars around because they're super expensive. And so we just didn't have a great way to follow these bears to see if they were coming back to Churchill and were likely to get in trouble again, or if they were going to another community and might get in trouble there. So with this new ear tag technology, we're able to apply tags to, again, almost any bear that's handled and released by the alert program, and we can see what happens. We can see what their behavior is. Do they just hang around the coast like we hope they do and jump on the ice and go back out to being polar bears and staying out of trouble? Or, are they taking a different path? And that real-time information that also can be relayed to conservation officers on the ground. So if we see a tag bear heading in towards the community, we can give them a heads up, let them know, exactly where the bear is and kind of the trajectory, and then they can take appropriate precautions on their end. So it's giving us some really good information on kind of what happens to these problem bears once they're handled and released.
Very important information for sure. We did get a question in from Ryan to go back to the den cams really quick. How do you find the dens to set up these den cams? How do you even know?
So it depends on where. A lot of our early den work was done on the North Slope of Alaska, and there we had either collared females, so dens that were known to researchers because they were tagged. We had dens that were by industry, mostly by security personnel who physically saw a female dig a hole into a riverbank or a bluff there. And then we had a third method, which was using data from forward-looking infrared surveys that industry does in Alaska to clear an area before they go and do work in the winter. And so these infrared surveys would give us hotspots or potential dens that we could then set up on to see if anything came out or not. So kind of those three methods. In Svalbard, where we work right now with the Norwegian Polar Institute, it's all research bears. So these are all known dens from bears that are wearing active collars.
That sounds like a lot of different uses of innovation and technology to find polar bears. Very cool stuff. Thank you for that explanation, Jeff. I want to hop over to a different type of thing we study about polar bears. We've been talking a lot about tracking, and probably we'll talk even a little bit more about tracking. But a really important thing that we study with polar bears is their diet and how much energy they need. As their sea ice habitat is declining, polar bears are expending more energy, finding the same or less amounts of food. And knowing how much energy they need and what they're eating and when is so critical to knowing what's going to happen to them and how the population is faring. Stephanie, I was hoping you could speak a little bit about the diets and energy research that we do with polar bears.
Yeah, of course. Well, we like to say that energy is the currency of life. Every biological process that occurs in your body costs energy. So even when you're sleeping, your body needs energy to keep cells alive and functioning. And things get much more costly when you are growing or reproducing. Now, polar bears experience a feast and fast lifestyle. Every year when the Arctic sea ice disappears, they lose access to their seal prey. So in order to survive that fasting period, polar bears must feast on seals while the ice remains to build up enough fat stores to cover their energetic costs when the ice is gone. So understanding how much energy polar bears need to cover essential biological processes like reproduction or movement. All that movement we're seeing on the bear trackers, that all costs energy. And that helps us to understand how their ability to reproduce and survive might be impacted by changes in their diet and prey availability. Polar bears are actually the only fully carnivorous species of bear, and they're further specialized to eat fat. And the fatty prey necessary for their lifestyle is only available in the marine ecosystem. Those big blubber stores on marine prey like whales and seals make it possible for the polar bears to build up the large fat stores that they need to survive that long fasting season when there is no food. And there's absolutely no land-based prey that can provide that same high energy fat content as blubber. So if a bear runs out of fat stores before the end of that fasting season, there's no replacement in the diet on land. So the polar bear will begin to starve, unfortunately.
That sounds like a very important area of study for polar bears. Of course, very critical. We all need to eat and need to balance our energy, like you said. And anyone listening out there, there are a lot of things we can do to help polar bears, and we're going to talk about that very shortly. We have a wonderful video to show you, and we should say that Polar Bear Week is coming up first week of November, and we're going to every day have new activities that you can take part in to help polar bears. We can all take part to help them and protect their future and our future. We have a couple more questions coming in. To shoot them both to you because they're about what you were talking about. Do the den cameras, this is from Lolly, do the den cameras turn 360 degrees? Can they do a full spin, or are they kind of restricted with how they can turn? Cool question.
Right now, the cameras we're using are directional cameras, and we're doing that in part just to get that focal view area towards the known den or towards the likely den. We have started to play around with 360 cams. So we do have one winter of data from Norway where we had a 360 cam out. We got some really cool northern light shots and time-lapse kind of mountain scenery shots there. And what we were interested in with that is if a bear is sitting out at the den site and its behavior suddenly changes, why? What was going on? So being able to see what the bear is seeing, being able to see what's going on around the bear could be a pretty cool additional source of information for the camera system. So it's definitely something we're continuing to look at.
That is very cool. I want to give another quick shout out to the explore.org cams. They are also not 360 degree cams necessarily, though the buggy one cam maybe kind of is, though part of it is just the buggy one you'll see. But check out the explore.org bear cams. They are incredible. We have some great footage. I'm not only going to see polar bears this morning. There was a wolverine on the cams, pretty spectacular. Technology is pretty darn cool when it comes to this stuff. Again, Jack, question here from Arla. Is anyone researching the polar bears in Alaska right now?
Yes, so USGS has ongoing long-term monitoring, but when you say right now, if you mean this year, this unusual year, the answer would be no, because almost all polar bear research across the Arctic was canceled this year, due primarily to travel restrictions, but also to countries just being very careful about protecting northern communities. Northern communities are super remote, right? They're small. They don't have the kind of medical resources that you and I have. And so they really weren't in a position to deal with the current pandemic, and countries took that to heart around the Arctic and were just super protective to try to make sure that, this didn't reach those northern communities, or if it did, it was small enough that they could handle it. So most research this year was canceled. And again, we're super lucky at Polar Bears International that some of our work is based in technology. And so we were able to continue progress on several projects over the course of the summer and continuing now here in Churchill.
Which is a great segue into our next topic, the adhesive tags, which Jeff, I will also ask you about. But I, again, just want to give a quick shout out to Katie Miller on the back end of the show. You don't see her, but she's the one doing all this mixing and doing an incredible job at it. Thank you, Katie, for mixing in all this great footage with us speaking. So as I said, Polar Bears International has been fortunate to continue some of our work. And we've spoken about a couple different types of GPS technology today, the collars and then the ear tags. But there's a new project that we're doing that we've luckily been able to move forward on during these crazy times. Jeff, could you speak a little bit about the Adhesive Tag project?
Sure. So for literally decades, we've been looking at ways to improve tagging and tracking methods and to, in a sense, get away from just relying on collars and just relying on collars from adult female bears. So having data from that broader population. And polar bears, as you can imagine, are super challenging to put anything on, right? Just look at where they live. They're big, strong animals. They are in and out of the seawater year round. They live at temperatures that go down to -40, -50 in the winter and up, in the plus 70, 80 Fahrenheit range in the summer. So they're quite a test case for technology, but we've continued to look for ways. In 2016 at the International Bear Association meeting, there was a workshop on polar bear tracking, and PBI took the assignment of trying to come up with a better way to attach an adhesive tag to polar bear fur or skin. And it has taken quite a few years, but we finally found the right partner with 3M, based out of Minnesota there in the US. And as you can imagine, 3M adhesion kind of broadly is what they do, whether that's a mechanical adhesion like hook and loop, also called Velcro, or whether that's an adhesive product like a glue. They have the scientists and engineers who perfect those things. And so over the past year and a half, we've worked with some of their teams. And this year we are looking at 4 prototype adhesive tags. 2 of them are purely mechanical, relying on the polar bear's hair to hold on. 2 of them are a hybrid. They have mechanical aspects, but also adhesive aspects. They look incredibly promising. They require no alteration of the fur, no shaving. You can leave everything intact, which is better for the bear. They require no holes to be poked, so they're a step above the ear tags that we talked about earlier. And we hope to test them out in coming months, either here in Manitoba or with partners in Norway next spring.
Very, very cool. We're very excited about this project. It is going to open up a whole new type of way to understand polar bears. Very nice. Thank you for that, Jeff. Again, if you guys have questions, please do stick them in the chat box or email questions@pbears.org. We really want to hear from you and know what you want to know. Also, I would really be curious if you're in a classroom right now, maybe now or later, if you're looking for an activity, is there something that you want to know about bears that even scientists don't know? There's a lot of things we still don't know about polar bears. If you came up with a question about polar bears, how could you come up with a way to solve that or answer that question? How could you use technology to answer a question about polar bears or really any animal? You can be as creative as possible. A lot of the solutions we talked about today, technologies that have been come up with, they just started from people talking about questions and kind of brainstorming, well, what if we tried this or what if we tried this? And it takes a while to refine an idea and get a new piece of technology, but it's also a lot of fun and very worthwhile. So I want to change gears a little. Stephanie, I'm going to come back to you. We're talking very much about kind of equipment-based research so far, cams and GPS and things like that, but there is kind of a different related but side of research that we call modeling. And modeling, especially for the future of polar bears, is so critical to help inform us about what they're facing, what we can do about it, and how fast to act. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit about your research, recent research that's come out. Stephanie was part of a huge paper in Nature Climate Change, which for scientists is a pretty big deal. And they used math and innovation along with her co-authors to come up with some really important information about polar bears in the future that they're facing.
Right. So as I mentioned, we work with energy and trying to create models that represent how polar bears use energy. So we use that idea of energy as a create an energy budget model where we have mathematical equations that estimate how much energy a bear spends on keeping their cells alive, how much they spend on movement, how much they spend on growth and reproduction, solely based on a bear's weight and length. So having this model then allows us to perform simulations to look at how polar bear survival and reproduction might be impacted due to climate change impacts on food supply or movement. So in this paper, we used the energy budget model to essentially perform an exercise in counting calories. We estimated how fat or how thin bears could possibly be when they started that fasting period, and also how much energy they use each day during a fasting period to determine the maximum length that they can fast before mums run out of energy to nurse their cubs, or for adult bears, how long can they go before they starve themselves? And we took these fasting thresholds and compared them to climate model projections for future Arctic sea ice patterns in each polar bear subpopulation to see when the predicted fasting periods became too long for each population to cope with. Now here we looked at when polar bear impact thresholds would cross in two climate scenarios. So one scenario with very high greenhouse emissions that pushes heavily for fossil fuels, and one scenario where we performed moderate mitigation and helped keep this Arctic sea ice from being lost as quickly. Now, in that extreme case, we are likely to lose every polar bear population in the world, except perhaps the Queen Elizabeth Islands, that QE population there, by 2100. But if we manage to mitigate, we are really giving polar bears a chance. We would still lose some southern populations, but most populations avoid predictions that loss of the population is very likely. So it's really difficult to predict how humans will act, but the more we do and the more quickly we do it, the better it is for the bears. Although we can't state the exact reduction in emissions necessary to save polar bears, we do know that the goals outlined in this agreement would actually send us down a lower greenhouse gas emission scenario than each scenario we explored here and give polar bears a better chance. So reducing the amount of greenhouse gas in our atmosphere could halt and even reverse the increase of global temperatures, allowing the Arctic sea ice cycle to recover. And if the sea ice recovers, then the Arctic ecosystem can recover to sustain its top predator, the polar bear.
Thank you so much, Steph. Yeah, I think that's such an important point. We have the power to change these projections and to make sure that the Arctic and polar bears can recover and the Arctic can continue to be a healthy ecosystem for not just polar bears, but all the creatures that rely on sea ice, including people. So when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, we release carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. And in regular amounts, this isn't so bad. Our atmosphere is filled with carbon dioxide anyway. It keeps us at a nice regular temperature. But the problem, we're burning too many fossil fuels, and we are pumping rampant amounts of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And this is thickening this like blanket around the earth that's just getting too hot. Imagine you're at home and you pile yourself under a bunch of blankets to hang out. After a few minutes, it's getting pretty hot in there, and it's not very comfortable. And that's kind of what we're doing to our earth. The good thing is that we have the solutions to change this. So we can look at more renewable and greener energy sources. We can look at solar and wind power, which there are more of now than ever. Maybe you feel like you don't have the power to make major changes right now, which is totally understandable, depending especially what grade you're in, but you can talk to your parents and teachers and your principals to see if there's any way that your school could get involved with some sort of community action. Maybe you could do a thermostat challenge, a 2 up, 2 down, change your thermostats at your school and compete with another school or all the schools in your district to see who can save the most energy. Maybe there's a kind of bike club you could join where kids go biking instead of driving all the time with their parents. You can go for a walk instead of have your parents drive you in the car to go to soccer practice. Or there's little things we can do, but it's important to remember that it's a community issue and we need leaders at the top of power and who are in charge of these large policies. We need them to make the big changes. And we can do that by raising our voices and letting them know that this is important to us. This is our future. It's the polar bear's future, and we want our future to be healthy and sustainable. And so we can leverage our voices and let the people in power know that this matters to us. And we've got a great video we're going to show you at the end of this broadcast about that. Because at the end of the day, polar bears and people are so tied together in so many ways, especially for northern communities. It's so critical that we keep these communities and the Arctic ecosystem intact and safe. And the safety thing we kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, but I think that it's a very important use of technology to keep polar bears and people safe. And so we're going to end on one final piece of technology that we're using right now. And I'm going to go back to you, Jeff. Maybe could you speak a little bit about the Polar Bear Radar or Spotter RF project that's happening right now that you're a part of?
Sure. So that's another project we were just lucky enough this year was technology based. So what we're trying to do on this file is to use technology and engineering in this case to see if compact surveillance radar, which is a military technology, can detect polar bears coming into a community or a camp. There's a picture of the panels there. They're like little iPads, and each one kind of lays down a cone out in front of it that detects anything out there that moves. So we've proven over the last couple of years it definitely will detect bears along with a bunch of other things. Here's a detection in progress there. The black dot in the middle is kind of where the radar is mounted, and the yellow X is a polar bear that's walking away that you can see in the top left corner of the video screen. What we're doing this year are a couple of things. One is we're teaching an artificial intelligence module, which is part of this system, to specifically identify a polar bear target from a caribou, from an Arctic fox, from a human, because we don't care about those other things as far as protecting a community. We want to know what is out there that looks bear-like and kind of limit the number of alerts that the radar gives. There's a picture again that the radar is controlling the camera, so it swivels the camera around so you can see what's out there, what's coming in. But the hope is once we get this dialed in, that conservation officers in places like Churchill or rangers around the Arctic could use this technology to better detect and deter bears from communities and camp situations. And the beauty of it is not only does it tell you something's out there, it tracks it in real time. So as you're responding or your wildlife officers are responding, you can tell them exactly where to go when it's in the dark. If it's snowing or foggy, doesn't matter. The system works through all that. So very promising, and we hope to actually roll it out for testing in Longyearbyen, Norway this coming year.
Very cool. So Jeff, the radar basically has night vision. Melissa wants to know, do polar bears have night vision?
Polar bears see really well and hear really well and smell really well, as you would expect from a large top predator that lives in this challenging environment. All of their senses are exceptional as far as we know. And there have been some basic sight tests done with polar bears in captivity. It's one of those great areas where bears in captivity can provide information we simply can't get in the wild. We've done hearing tests with bears in captivity to understand better what polar bears can hear. And one project that did not survive the current pandemic was a scent project, was supposed to launch this year with our friends at Brigham Young University and at the Hogle Zoo, but due to restrictions, that'll be pushed to next year, and hopefully we'll get that off the ground and learn more about how well polar bears smell, more specifically about how well they smell.
Well, I sure look forward to that project. That will be very interesting. So one last question from Joe, and then we're going to wrap up. Are the GPS collars waterproof? That's a great question. They're largely waterproof. They're, made to be used in the Arctic, in the cold and the wet. But polar bears sometimes do a good amount of swimming, depending on where they're at. And it is possible, and we do see these collars get kind of waterlogged. So it's not for us to be tracking the bears through the spring, and then as the sea ice starts to break up, we stop getting data for a few weeks as the collars get more waterlogged as the bears swim more. Now, often, once the bears are back on land, the collars kind of dry out a little bit and we can get that data back. It'll all of a sudden kind of be like, oh, dry now, here we go, satellite, here's the data. But sometimes they do get a bit waterlogged. But generally, they're pretty good and pretty robust. But, polar bears are tough on technology. Again, the Arctic is harsh. It's cold, it's wet. It's incredible that polar bears can make a living out there, and we want to make sure that they continue making a living out there. And we can do that with your help. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that today's webcast added value to your day and that you learn more about polar bears. We sure talked about a lot of different types of technology that we're using to study the bears. If you're a student or an adult just interested in more online learning, please do check out our education center online. We've got all sorts of materials and curriculum for you that's related to today's webcast and others. We also are on Flipgrid if you are, and we've got lots of wonderful YouTube videos for you about all sorts of different projects. We also have a feedback survey that we would really appreciate if you would fill out. You should see the link in the chat window. If you fill it out, you will be entered into a draw to win one of 3 polar bear adoptions, which is pretty fun and nice for the holiday season. We also want to thank our partner, Explore.org. Again, the polar bear cams, one of which is now, are incredible. Please do check them out. Explore also has so many other amazing wildlife cams. So you might take a deep dive into their website, and I encourage you to do so. Whether you want to actively learn or just relax by watching wildlife, either way, their cams are the way to go. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Steph, for both joining me today and talking a bit about polar bears. It was a great discussion. And we are just constantly being reminded how we're all so connected and we're depending on each other so much. And so we really thank, again, our sponsors, our panelists, and you, our viewers, for tuning in today. So we have more webcasts throughout the season, including next week, and we hope to see you there. And we are going to end on a really wonderful solutions video. Remember, we can all do our part to help polar bears, reducing our fossil fuel emissions. We have lots of options out there. We're going to stand up and have our voice be heard for the bears and for ourselves. So until next week, thank you so much. Hope you enjoy the next video. Bye.
Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. We hope you leave here feeling inspired and return home to leverage your voice and your influence, because together we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.